Justin Jefferson signed a mega extension with the Minnesota Vikings. We talk about if it was worth it for Minnesota, all that and more coming up next year on this episode of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostreicher. I'm the host of Locked On Ravens and one of the many NFL experts here on our network, Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here today on this Monday and making Locked On NFL a part of your day and your first listen each and every day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms and includes in video form on YouTube and audio form, wherever you get your shows. Today's episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Another week, another Locked On NFL. Kicking off the week with the biggest stories throughout the league. Now, we talked with Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings last week on Locked On NFL here on Monday. In less than 24 hours later, Justin Jefferson signs a mega extension with the Vikings. Obviously, that was covered extensively here on the channel, but I haven't had a chance to talk about it yet. So we'll talk with Luke in the first part of the show about is the Justin Jefferson contract worth it? Then we'll move into the second part of the show with Patricia Traina of Locked On Giants. We got word on Sunday that Darren Waller officially plans to retire, so we'll talk with Patricia about that. And then finally, Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers will join us to talk about the interesting Cam Sutton situation because Pittsburgh decided to sign him. So without any further ado, let's first get into our conversation with Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings. Justin Jefferson got quarterback money from the Minnesota Vikings. Here to talk about that with me and more today is Luke Braun, the host of Locked On Vikings. And Luke, long time no see. We were on here just last Monday talking about J.J. McCarthy, the Vikings offensive line, and we talked a little bit about Justin Jefferson and when that deal materialized. Well, quite literally,
it's coming.
Not 24 hours later, the Vikings in Justin Jefferson, 4 years, 140 total. He got $110 million guaranteed. Timing of this deal, Luke, you never wavered in terms of you thought this was getting done at some point. You thought it was going to come sooner rather than later. Might have to wait a little bit. Now, obviously, it came just a couple days ago. What was your overall shock level when you heard it was actually coming before minicamp started and you didn't have to wait? The Vikings didn't, at least, until training camp began.
Yeah, mandatory minicamp was kind of the deadline where, okay, if it's not done by then, then there starts to be tension about is he going to show up to like mandatory things, right? You're never going to show up to OTAs when you're in an active contract negotiation. That's basically the norm around the league now. So minicamp was kind of the day, like it's got to be done kind of this week, and then it was done this week. Like so, it was pretty much what I expected. The number was about what I expected. Kind of all the information because this had been discussed to death for a year. All of the details and information about it were pretty much, people had dialed it in to pretty much about what we saw. So as big as it was, as astounding as the number is, it also aligned like right about with everybody's expectations that was in the know about it.
Right. And again, you get this done before a lot of the other big time wide receivers. I mean, Jefferson essentially resets the market for some of these guys like Jamar Chase, potentially even T. Higgins out there in Cincinnati. But for this wide receiver room now, Luke, you have Justin Jefferson locked in long-term. Obviously, Jordan Addison is going to be a long-term fixture there as well. What's your confidence level? You look ahead 2, 3, 4 years for this Vikings team. What's your confidence level in this group?
That all comes down to J.J. McCarthy, honestly.
Sure.
That group, I'm pretty sure that one's not going to be the problem. If there's a problem, I guess I'll put it that way. Addison, I'm actually really excited about what he can do year 2. Beware him as a fantasy asset because he's sharing a field with Justin Jefferson. There's going to be a target share issue there. But in terms of what he can do for the offense, the way that Justin Jefferson attracts double teams is astounding. I mean, it's Randy Moss level of, if you're not doubling this guy, he's going to put up 200 on you. So we're going to see a lot of attention to Justin Jefferson. We've seen it the last 2 years. Everybody knows he's JJ. You got to put a safety up over the top of him. And the Vikings have sort of designed their offensive structure around finding ways to punish that. They trade for TJ Hawkinson in the middle of the season. he's a way to punish that. Some of the games where Jefferson got doubled the most, TJ Hawkinson will go off for 150 to your tight end. Like, that's the thing. Or now we've got Jordan Addison. He'll catch a bomb post and, he'll do his thing. And he even had some of his best moments with Justin Jefferson out last year. So he even stepped up and took over the role when he had to. So it's really exciting to have two guys that can do that. That's probably, like, honestly, that's the most exciting thing about the Vikings is that group of pass catchers. Especially once TJ Hawkinson is back, which now they're hinting at sort of maybe IR instead of PUP, which means maybe he'll be back by like the end of September, early October or something like that. I still think that's a little aggressive, but sometime in the middle of 2024, you get him back, you get the whole group, and then you kind of see where it's at. But ultimately, if the quarterback isn't the truth, all of that will fall apart. We've seen that in Atlanta, for example, and all of those exciting pass catchers. But then the quarterback wasn't real, fell apart. So it all comes down to that.
Yeah, I've fallen into that Kyle Pitts fantasy trap far too many times, or at least far more than I like.
Speaking of, beware of the fantasy.
Yeah, far more than I like to admit. I've fallen into even with Drake London. I'm just like, man, it's going to be the year finally, and it just it never was. And you're right, it was Desmond Ridder the whole way. Which
at least I think Drake London was like kind of a red zone guy, right? Like,
he was. Okay.
You got some,
Although I could never it was so hit or miss. I was like, do I start him every week? And the answer was no, because he would have. Wasn't quite the Gabe Davis level of fluctuation, but it certainly was fluctuation. Yeah. Now, in terms of this next question, Luke, I want to preface this by saying I have seen these takes, just throughout social media, article writers, podcasts, whatever it may be. The Justin Jefferson contract essentially changes the way that we're going to look at wide receiver contracts moving forward in a couple of different ways. I see you shaking your head, though.
No.
I see you shaking your head.
It's more in line with history than you think. It's just a big number because the cap is big, and we just are really bad at like recalibrating what we see as a record-setting amount of money versus just a very large amount of money. This is a very large amount of money. I think it's a top 3 contract, wide receiver contract ever. If you go by the percentage of cap that it uses, like average per year that it uses in the year that he is signed. Nobody would ever pay $35 million a year for any player, even a quarterback, like 5 years ago, like when we were in the pandemic, right? Like $35 million would have been unfathomable. It's now like super fathomable. So if you take, basically the way to look at it is take the salary cap this year, and then the average per year, which is $35 million a year for Justin Jefferson, and what percentage is that? It's like 13.7 or something like that. And then compare that. If you do that to Tyreek Hill's deal and compare that to Tyreek Hill's deal from a couple of years ago, Tyreek Hill is 14%. So this is actually higher by that metric, considering the resources that the Dolphins had available to them. It's one of those deals. You see, if you sort by that, there's a page on Over the Cap that'll do that. And you see Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Johnson. And so it's telling you we see Justin Jefferson in that rarefied air. And sure, considering what he's done so far, he's pushing all those guys' records. So that kind of makes sense to me, but I don't think it changes the market. I think he's just the first guy to sign a big deal now that the cap went up more than we thought. Yeah. So the market changed, but the market was always going to change no matter who it was. So I don't think it like changes the economics of football at all. Wide receivers are valuable. That's been proven time and time again. This one deserves a lot of that money, and a lot of that money is a little bit more real. Tyreek Hill's deal is filled with funny money on the end of it. No such thing here for Justin Jefferson. He's got 110 of that guaranteed. He's going to see that money. And what's also important to point out is that the real cap hits are deferred a couple years. Just the way the structure is, the real money doesn't really kick in until 2026. So 24 and 25, it's actually a really manageable cap hit. They're sitting at like $27 million for 2024 right now. They could go sign another couple big extensions if they wanted to. I'm looking at Cam Bynum, the safety. Mm-hmm. He's in a contract year. If they really wanted to get ahead of Christian Darrisaw, they could go do that. I think that's probably unnecessary, and I don't think Christian Darrisaw would. There's no reason for him to say yes to a contract this early. It's probably behooves him to wait, so I don't expect that to happen, but they got the money to if they wanted to try to work that out. So there's a lot of options still cap-wise. They just, locked up the best player on the team until 2028. So we're all celebrating here in Minnesota.
Yeah, and that's exactly the take where it was like, okay, the two part of the take was, yes, is it changing the wide receiver market? And then everyone was like, well, is this worth it for Minnesota? And I'm just like, everybody, please. Everybody.
Right. You're never going to not do it. Like, guys, like you don't get Justin Jeffersons with cap dollars. You get them by hitting on them in the draft, and then you keep them with cap dollars. Yes. These guys don't hit the free agent market ever. They always get paid. There is no world where the team was not going to pay him. That's Madden franchise mode, dynasty, fantasy fiction.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly why the T. Higgins situation in Cincinnati is so perplexing, because usually it's like, okay, T. Higgins would just resign there and there'd be no question about it. But you have Chase and Higgins, and it kind of makes for, okay, a who's who game in that franchise. And also, Luke, when you're talking about it, is it worth it? I'm like, well, the Vikings quite literally have a rookie quarterback. And so if you want to essentially say, yes, JJ McCarthy is going to be on a very manageable, team-friendly deal for at least the next 4 seasons, potentially 5, depending on that 5th-year option and what that looks like. This was the best time to ever do it, considering this is a 4-year deal for Jefferson. McCarthy's at least under contract for 4 years on that rookie deal. It lines up perfectly for, I think, the roster construction in Minnesota to where you can look ahead 4 or 5 years and you can reevaluate once that's done.
And I'll even add to that, you've got team control of Jordan Addison through 2028. You have team control of TJ Hawkinson through 2028. You're going to get Darrisaw done next year in all likelihood. Brian O'Neill is locked up for a while. You have basically the next 3 or 4 years, that the core of that offense will remain all the same group of guys. And now we find out if it works. And if it doesn't, if it's a disaster and they're 3-14 and the quarterback sucks and maybe we have to go a different direction and steer out of it. But it's very clear the plan for the offense was rookie quarterback, really good surroundings, try to develop him with our quarterback friendly head coach. And then let's see how far that takes us. And now we have like 3 years where we kind of don't have to do anything to keep that offense together, and all the off-season stuff will be focused on fixing the defense.
Luke is great, and for more on Luke, check him out over at the Locked On Vikings podcast and right here on Locked On NFL, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up in the second part of the show, Patricia Traina of Locked On Giants will join us to talk about Darren Waller's retirement. Stay tuned, plenty to get to on the show. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all over on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. So for the MLB MVP, I mean, we're still a couple months away from that being announced, but you have Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, Gunnar Henderson, a lot of people over there. Plus, the NFL season starting up in a couple months as well. That opening game, Ravens and Chiefs over on FanDuel. The Ravens opened up as 2.5-point underdog. So if you want to bet on that line or monitor it, as it's probably going to change over the next couple months, you can do that on FanDuel as well. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. We're back here, our second segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Monday. Appreciate everybody for being here again, making Locked On NFL your first listen each and every day and a part of your day in general. Also, be sure to make Locked On Sports Today a part of your day with Peter Bukowski, who covers all of the sports landscape every single Monday through Friday. So Locked On Sports Today, part of Locked On Podcast Network, here, your team every single day. Now, we'll talk with Patricia Traina of Locked On Giants as Darren Waller announced his retirement, or he informed the Giants he intends to retire. So we'll talk with Patricia about what Darren Waller meant to the Giants and what life looks like without him now. Darren Waller provided some news on Sunday about his future plans, and that is that he is retiring from the NFL. Here to talk about that with me is Patricia Traina, the host of Locked On Giants. Patricia, I think that some decision was coming at some point here for Darren Waller. No one knew exactly when, but Darren Waller making the call on Sunday. How surprised were you, one, that this happened at this particular time, and two, that the decision was actually to retire instead of keep playing?
I wasn't surprised with either, to be honest with you. I knew that it was going to be made before the team reported for their mandatory minicamp, which they will do on Monday, because obviously if a player does not show up for a mandatory minicamp, unless he is excused by the head coach and GM, he is subject to fine. So I kind of figured all along that it would come down to the wire and be a last-minute decision, which it was. I also kind of figured right from the get-go, I mean, the longer Waller stayed away from the Giants, I said, he's not coming back. The longer you stay away from something, you get used to another type of life or whatever. And he was into his music. He's trying to launch a music career. It was just kind of all pointing in the same direction. So to be honest with you, it kind of worked out the way I thought it would.
And Darren Waller ended up releasing a video kind of outlining his decision and everything leading up to it. Can you kind of go into a little detail, Patricia, of the reasons Darren Waller stated for the reason he's going to retire and not come back to the league?
Yeah, so the video was very heartfelt. It was very raw as far as emotion goes. He talked about an incident that he had last offseason. He had just gotten injured in the Jet game, and he was left behind. The following week they went to play the Raiders out in Las Vegas, and he was left behind to do his rehab. And he had shot a video, I guess on his day off or whatever, and he was coming back from that video, and suddenly he didn't feel well, and he thought, oh, maybe it's COVID. I've had COVID too, a couple times before. Maybe I'm coming down with it. Well, whatever it was he had, he started shaking. He felt feverish, and it got to the point where, he had trouble breathing, and it was scary enough for him to call 911. So police and paramedics came to his townhouse. They brought him into the hospital, where he said he was hospitalized for 3 days. And that kind of, the way he described it sounded like a near-death experience. So that kind of, put things into perspective for him. Like, look, like he said in his video, he said, look, I technically should have died at least several times before because of my substance abuse, addictions and whatnot. And here I am. And that kind of put everything into perspective for him. He was by himself at the time. I guess his wife was out in Las Vegas, where she played for the Aces of the WNBA. So yeah, he just kind of started thinking about it, and then you throw the injuries and how the season went, and it just kind of just compiled. It all piled up on him and caused him to reflect and say, hey, what am I doing here? What do I want to do with whatever time I have left on this earth?
Yeah, we know Waller did have a troubled past, and obviously the way that he pulled himself out of that is remarkable and memorable, but there's so much that goes into a retirement, whether it's on field, off field. So Waller feeling this is the best decision for him at this time. But for the Giants, Patricia, he was one of their better pass catching weapons. And in that tight end room now, there is a lot of inexperience. Now, I think they are decently well prepared, but let's start with Waller's loss. What does that mean for Daniel Jones and the rest of this offense?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at why the Giants acquired Waller, they did so because, for years they had Saquon Barkley and really nobody else. There was nobody else that kept opposing defenses up at night to worry about. So now, you bring in Waller, and a healthy Waller with a healthy Saquon Barkley would have maybe given opposing defenses something to think about. Well, now the Giants don't have Barkley. They don't have Waller. They do have Malik Neighbors. So guess what? Now there's all kinds of pressure on this rookie who is yet to take an NFL snap. I mean, we're all optimistic that he's going to be a legitimate number one, that he's going to be 1,000-yard receiver, that he's going to be a difference maker. But now the target is on his back, firmly on his back, because all you need is for one defensive coordinator to figure out how to take him out of the game and say to Daniel Jones in the running game, hey, you guys beat us. And now things get very interesting. So that's the impact of losing a healthy Waller.
And now because of the retirement, other guys are going to have to step up in that tight end room. Now, Daniel Bellinger has been someone who has taken on some level of a role for the Giants, but who else, Patricia, in that tight end room is going to have to make a name for themselves in order to mitigate the loss of Waller?
Well, I think the rookie Theo Johnson, their 4th-round draft pick, is definitely going to be someone who's going to have to step up. But as far as the third tight end goes, that's going to be an interesting call because it depends on how the Giants coaches want to pursue that, because you can classify the tight ends as flex tight ends and inline tight ends. All right. So is the offensive line improved enough to where you can say, okay, maybe we don't need an inline guy. We can get away with another flex guy, because Waller was a flex guy. He was a guy in the passing game. You can move all the, wherever you wanted to. And he wasn't really much of a blocker. So you've got to hope that the offensive line now has got its stuff together, got its act together. Right. So it really depends on what the Giants see. I don't think they're going to make a decision right away, but I do suspect they will add another tight end to that room because they've got a guy, Tyree Jackson, who I think is dealing with an arm injury. I don't know how well that's going to keep him out, but that room is now getting a little thin.
Now, do you see them maybe going out and trying to sign a veteran or acquire a veteran tight end? Do you think they're going to try to trust their youth and see who steps up?
I think they're going to see who steps up. I mean, you don't want to jump the gun and say, oh my God, we got to panic and bring somebody in. So, I mean, I think they want to see what they have. But there are some guys out there. For example, UFL, there's a guy by the name of Jace Sternberger, who's a guy we talked about on my show. There's another guy, Hopkins, who was with the Rams. I think Bryson Hopkins, who's still a free agent. There are potential cap cuts that are coming up at the end of training camp that they can look at. So first you see what you've got, and if you can develop these guys a little bit further. Remember, tight ends, that's one of the positions where you really need to see them in pads, which we have not been able to do this spring because of the rules. So I think, they're going to wait a little bit, see what they've got, also assess where they are in terms of the health of the position, and then decide if they're going to bring somebody else in.
Patricia's awesome. And for more on Patricia, check her out over at the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up in the final part of the show, we're going to have Chris Carter join us to talk about the addition of Cam Sutton to the Steelers secondary. So we should have staged a lot to get to on the show. We're back. Our final segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Ostreicher is still talking with you. Opening week edition of the show here on Monday. I appreciate everybody again for tuning in. Be sure to follow along video form and audio form on this channel. We give you 5 days a week of NFL content Monday through Friday. Now let's talk with Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers. The Steelers adding Cam Sutton, but his situation is rather peculiar. So we'll talk about that with Chris now. The Pittsburgh Steelers added to their secondary and bringing back a familiar face, Cam Sutton, formerly of the Detroit Lions, now back in Pittsburgh. Here to talk about that with me is Chris Carter, the host of Locked On Steelers. And Chris, Cam Sutton, this is not the first time he's been in the news this offseason, as it was reported that he was just not able to be found. Had some charges brought against him, some accusations made, and the cops could not find him. And eventually turned himself in. It was a whole situation for a couple of weeks. Now he's in Pittsburgh, signs with the Steelers. What are the events that led up to this signing, and why was the whole process so confusing up to this point?
So it is confusing because I think a lot of people don't understand how often these things work in court. As a person with a law degree, I have some understanding. I did work in criminal law practices before I switched to being a journalist. But basically, the facts that we know about Cameron Sutton is that sometime in the late winter, early spring, there was an incident that occurred that led to this affidavit being filed by an accuser. That accuser levied that, and Cam Sutton, when Hillsborough County of Florida, when their sheriff's office went to try to contact Cam Sutton to discern this and say, okay, we have these allegations, we need to talk to you. They could not find him because he wasn't in Florida, and it turned out he was in Detroit training with the Lions. And then once he could not be found for like a 2-week period, they then put out a press release, and that's when it hit ESPN. It was like, hey, Cam Sutton's on the lam, and we don't know if he was on the lam or if he was just in Detroit working out with the Lions, but and people can assume here or there, like they say, oh, Chris, that he was doing that, or he was just doing his workout, whatever. We don't know that part of it. What we do know is that 11 days after that, he turned himself in, and then those felony charges that were related to the original affidavit were dropped down to a misdemeanor once the police were able to talk to him. And then after that, the judge put him in a pretrial diversion program. If people don't know what that is often what happens when defendants go into a program, they take some classes, and then afterwards, the incident is struck from the record. They don't have these charges on their permanent record. So there's that too. So basically, if this pretrial diversion program, I'm not sure how long his is for Florida. I don't know their state laws or anything like that. But once that ends, he is free and clear and of any charges. And so probably what the Steelers were looking at here, and there had been reports that they had been in contact with him, that they had checked in with him, like, hey, what's going on? Because they drafted him in the 2017 draft, and he was a key player for the Steelers for 6 years before he went and signed with the Detroit Lions before last season. So I think there was some checking in to see, hey, what's going on here. And then once the smoke had cleared and he was in the pretrial diversion program, the Steelers, I think they sat down one last time and they said, hey, we'll sign you to a vet minimum contract, 1-year deal. We'll see what happens here. So that's how we got here. And now Cameron Sutton, in fact, we spoke to him. We had clips of him on the Locked On Steelers podcast, talking with us and asking him questions. So what we do know now is that he's with the Steelers at their facility. He's practicing with them and he's part of the team.
Now, could he be facing any league discipline for this? Could you see a 2, 4, whatever it be, suspension for him? Or since, the situation has played out the way it has, is there not going to be anything from the league?
No, absolutely. There's probably going to be something from the league. The league has always maintained, no matter what happens in the courts, we get our say at some point. And so the judge may have him in a pretrial diversion program. That doesn't mean he might get a 2 or 4 game suspension. I'm not honestly sure about the NFL policies as what qualifies for which, as far as how many games. But I do think there will be some response from the league about this, because the league has tried to take a stronger stance against domestic violence, and that's what this was part of the allegations. So and who knows, maybe nothing will come of it, but I think that the league is going to try to do what they can do to have a say on this. And I do think the Steelers are kind of even prepared for that. That's why they're like, hey, it's just a vet minimum 1-year deal. If he's not available, okay, well, they lose out on $1.2 million or whatever. But yeah, so there's probably going to be something. We don't know what it'll be, and we don't know when that'll happen.
Right. And so obviously Pittsburgh, the fact that they brought him in, they have to feel at least comfortable with the situation and what they have found out, and what they have as a team have figured out about the situation. But now with Sutton in the fold in the secondary, Chris, obviously is a familiar face in the Pittsburgh organization. What did they see in him from his first stint in Pittsburgh, whether it be on the field, off of it, whatever, that made them want to bring him back and potentially contribute in the secondary this season?
Well, I know a lot of people are going to look at what he did with the Lions last year and be like, he gave up 8 touchdowns, a passer rating of 122 allowed. That's not great. He only had one interception. That's not what you want to see. Well, part of it's because when the Lions signed him, they signed him to be like their top corner to take on number 1 receivers. And that's not what Cam Sutton's the best at. Cam Sutton is a decent cornerback, but he's much better of a cornerback when he's allowed to be that flexible guy that plays in the slot, but also helps on the outside and helps as an extra safety on the field. His key is versatility, is lining up everywhere and lining up primarily in the slot. And now the Steelers have a system, and when he was with the Steelers for the first 6 years, his last year with the Steelers, he did allow 4 touchdowns, but he also had 3 interceptions, 8 passes broken up, and the passer rating when he was targeted was 69.6. He was very solid. They moved him around, and he was part of the system. And honestly, he was a big part of what allowed Minkah Fitzpatrick to kind of stay out of the slot and play more free safety. And that was when that same year where Cam Sutton had 3 interceptions, Minkah Fitzpatrick also had 6. This year, Cam Sutton was gone. Minkah Fitzpatrick had 0. And that's not a direct correlation, but it's part of the piece of the puzzle that we've been talking about on Locked On Steelers, that the Steelers needed help at different parts of their defense so that Minkah Fitzpatrick wouldn't play 5 roles and he could just play his main role of being that center fielding free safety. That's where Sutton comes in. I think what they're going to ask of him is like, hey, Joey Porter Jr. is the number 1 corner. We know that now. Dante Jackson's brought in. He's probably your number 2 corner. What you're going to do is you're going to be the slot corner, or you're going to help Dante Jackson on the outside, or you're going to bump out, or we're going to, fake a blitz with you and drop you into a zone or blitz with you. But he's going to be that versatile corner. He knows the defense. He knows Terrell Austin, the defensive coordinator. It's funny. The only 2 people in the secondary that were there when he was there 2 years ago are Minkah Fitzpatrick and DeMonte KZ. But that's, I think, to the advantage of the Steelers that those guys know, because they're the ones that are going to be relaying a lot of the signals. And Cam Sutton is big on communication. He was in the Steelers. His rookie year was my first year in the Steelers locker room. And that was one of the things that he got fast and that made him such an available. They had him starting in key divisional games in 2017, and he played well in those as a rookie. So, so I'd say that he's probably going to be a slot corner that flexes around the field, and that's what they're going to be really excited to have him for.
Chris providing the insight, and for more on Chris, check him out over at Locked On Steelers and right here on Locked On NFL, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That's all I have for you here today on Locked On NFL. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow with your Tuesday host talking more NFL, so be sure to stay tuned. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On NFL.